the morning of September 1st, 1939, broke over Poland with a silence that felt unnatural. The kind of silence that presses against your chest, that makes you hold your breath without realizing it. In the pre-dawn darkness, the airfields of East Prussia hummed with a different kind of energy, mechanical, relentless, hungry. Oberleutnant Hans-Ulrich Rudel stood beside his Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, running his gloved hand along the gull wing's leading edge. The metal was cold, almost biting through the leather. He was 23 years old, his face still carrying the softness of youth beneath the Luftwaffe cap. But his eyes had already begun to change. They carried the weight of what was about to begin, even if he didn't fully understand it yet. Around him, the 2/2 Immelmann prepared for war. Mechanics made final checks on the dive brakes, those distinctive slotted flaps that would scream like the damned when deployed. Armorers loaded the single SC-250 bomb beneath the fuselage, 550 pounds of high explosive that would soon carve craters into Polish soil. The rear gunner, Unteroffizier Ernst Gatermann, checked his 7.92 mm MG-15 machine gun for the third time. His hands weren't shaking. Not yet. The briefing had been clinical, delivered by Hauptmann Walter Siegel with the precision of a mathematics lecture. Their target, the Dessau bridges over the Vistula River. 2 railroad bridges, critical to Polish mobilization. Intelligence suggested minimal anti-aircraft defenses. Suggested was a word that carried a lot of weight when you were about to dive at a target at 400 miles per hour. Rudel climbed into the cramped cockpit, the smell of oil and cordite and sweat already thick in the confined space. The instrument panel glowed dimly. Altimeter, airspeed indicator, dive angle indicator. That last one was crucial. 70 degrees. That was the angle. Too shallow and you missed. Too steep and you couldn't pull out. The Jumo 211 engine coughed, then roared to life, the propeller becoming a blur of deadly motion. All along the flight line, Stukas awakened. The sound was biblical, a mechanical chorus announcing the end of one world and the brutal birth of another. At exactly 4:45 a.m., as German artillery began pounding Polish positions along the border, 9 Stukas of Rudel's Staffel lifted into the darkness. The landing gear folded up with a hydraulic whine. The gull wings bit into the air. Below, Poland still slept, unaware that in minutes everything would change. The flight took 32 minutes. 32 minutes of tight formation flying, engines thrumming, eyes scanning the horizon for Polish PZL fighters that intelligence said wouldn't be there. Intelligence was sometimes wrong. The sky lightened from black to deep blue to a pale gray that revealed the landscape below. Fields, forests, the silver ribbon of the Vistula cutting through the morning mist. Rudel could see the bridges now. 2 dark lines across the river, fragile-looking from this altitude. Fragile but essential. Cut those bridges and you cut Poland's ability to reinforce the corridor. Military logic. Clean. Simple. Deadly. Target acquired. Siegel's voice crackled over the radio. Prepare for attack dive. On my mark. This was it. The moment between peace and war, between theory and reality, between the man you were and the man you would become. The formation broke apart, each Stuka peeling away to set up its individual attack run. Rudel pushed the stick forward slightly, gaining speed, positioning himself. His heart hammered against his ribs. His mouth was dry. He swallowed hard. Below, Polish soldiers were probably having breakfast. Lighting cigarettes. Joking. Living. Not for much longer. Rudel checked his instruments one final time. Fuel mixture rich. Propeller pitch set. Dive brakes ready. Everything by the book. Everything exactly as they'd trained 100 times over the forests of Germany. But this wasn't training. This was real. The people down there would die because of what he was about to do. That thought sat in his stomach like a stone, cold and heavy and undeniable. But orders were orders. War was war. and the bridges had to fall. He rolled inverted, and the world turned upside down. Sky became earth. Earth became sky. For a fraction of a second, Rudel hung in his harness, suspended between two realities. Then he pulled back on the stick and committed to the dive. There was no turning back now. The Stuka's nose dropped toward the earth like a falcon stooping on prey. The dive brakes deployed with their signature shriek, the Jericho trumpets that would haunt a generation's nightmares. The sound was inhuman, mechanical, designed specifically to break the spirit of anyone who heard it. It worked. Even Rudel, who knew exactly what caused the sound, felt his spine tingle with primal fear. The airframe shuddered. Wind screamed past the canopy, and the ground rushed up with terrifying, unstoppable momentum. 70 degrees. The dive angle indicator held rock steady as Rudel's world compressed into a tunnel of focus. The bridge filled his bomb sight, growing larger with each heartbeat. Altimeter unwinding like a broken watch. 8,000 feet, 7,500, 7,000. The Stuka was screaming now, the Jericho trumpets wailing their song of destruction, and Rudel was riding that scream straight into hell. His training took over, body and machine becoming one, every movement automatic, drilled into him through endless repetition until thought and action were indistinguishable. The stick felt alive in his hands, vibrating with the force of the dive, and through that vibration he could feel everything. The airspeed building past 350 miles per hour, the stress on the wings, the precise moment when physics would demand he pull out or die trying. That's when the flak began. The first burst appeared off his left wing, a black flower blooming in the pale morning sky, then another, closer, and another. The Polish 40mm Bofors guns had woken up, their crews scrambling to their positions, loading, tracking, firing at the screaming devils falling from above. Intelligence had been wrong. Very wrong. The minimal defenses were anything but. Shrapnel pinged and clanged off the Stuka's armored belly, each impact like a hammer blow against sheet metal. Behind him, Gatorman's MG-15 opened up, tracers arcing down toward the muzzle flashes, more psychological than effective at this angle and speed, but it was something. Action against helplessness, defiance against death. Flak. Heavy flak at target, someone shouted over the radio, voice high and tight. Rudel didn't respond. Couldn't respond. All his concentration was focused on that bridge, on holding the dive angle, on not dying in the next 5 seconds. 6,000 feet. 5,000. The world had narrowed to a point. The bridge, only the bridge, everything else falling away into irrelevance. He could see details now. The metal trusses, the wooden railroad ties dark against the gray water, a supply truck stopped halfway across, tiny figures running. Polish soldiers, looking up, pointing. Their mouths open in shouts, he couldn't hear over the engine's roar and the wind scream and the wail of the dive brakes. They were so small, so fragile, so utterly doomed. A flak burst erupted directly in front of him, so close the shock wave rattled his teeth and filled his vision with black smoke. For one terrifying instant he was flying blind, the bridge gone, instruments obscured, nothing but darkness and the certain knowledge that he was still plummeting toward the earth at 400 miles per hour. Then he burst through the smoke, eyes watering, and the bridge reappeared, perfectly centered, perfectly aligned. 4,000 feet. 3,500. His thumb moved to the bomb release, hovering there, waiting for the exact right moment. Too early and the bomb would fall short, exploding harmlessly in the river. Too late and he'd be too low to pull out, would follow his own bomb into the target, would become just another crater in the Polish soil. Training said release at 3,000 feet. Experience, what little he had, said trust your instincts. Another flak burst, this one behind him, the Polish gunners tracking him down, learning his speed, his angle, preparing to blow him out of the sky. Gatorman's gun went silent. Either jammed or out of ammunition or the gunner was hit. Rudel didn't dare turn to check. 3,200 feet. Almost there. Almost. No. His thumb pressed the release. The Stuka lurched upward as 550 pounds of death dropped free, and Rudel immediately hauled back on the stick with both hands, every muscle in his body straining against the G-forces that wanted to keep him diving, wanted to smash him into the earth like a bug on a windshield. The world grayed at the edges. Blood pooled in his legs. His vision tunneled. The stick felt like it weighed 100 pounds, and pulling it back was like trying to lift a car. The Stuka groaned, metal crying out in protest, rivets straining, the entire airframe threatening to tear itself apart. For 3 eternal seconds, Rudel existed in a twilight state between consciousness and blackout, between control and catastrophe, fighting his aircraft, fighting physics, fighting death itself. Then the pressure eased. The horizon appeared. Sky above, earth below, the natural order restored. He was level at 1,500 feet, racing away from the target at maximum speed, the Jumo 211 engine howling. Behind him, Gatorman gasped over the intercom, "I'm okay, I'm okay." Just winded from the G-forces then. Good. Rudel craned his neck to look back at the target, and what he saw made his heart sink. His bomb had struck the northern approach to the bridge. Close, so close, a crater smoking in the roadbed and the supply truck simply gone, vaporized, but the bridge itself still stood. A near miss. All that terror, all that risk for a near miss. But there was no time for disappointment because 2 more Stukas were already diving, their Jericho sirens splitting the morning air, and the flak was intensifying, the Polish gunners finding their rhythm, and then Rudel saw something that turned his blood to ice. Lieutenant Steen's Stuka, third in the attack sequence, took a direct hit at the bottom of its dive. There was no drama to it, no Hollywood explosion. One moment there was an aircraft pulling out of its attack run. The next moment there was a bright flash, a puff of black smoke, and a tumbling collection of burning debris that had been, seconds before, a machine and 2 men. The wreckage fell into the Vistula with a splash that seemed absurdly small, almost gentle, and then there was nothing. No parachute. No survivors. Just ripples spreading across the water and the war continuing as if nothing had happened. Steen is down. Steen is down. The voice on the radio was young, breaking, someone who had shared a barracks with Steen, who had played cards with him last night, who had promised to write to Steen's girl back home if anything happened. Now something had happened, and there would be a letter to write, and that young voice would have to find the words. The remaining Stukas completed their runs, bombs falling in sequence, and the morning filled with explosions and smoke and the screams of dying men. When the smoke finally cleared, drifting away on the morning breeze, both bridges were visible. The northern bridge was damaged, unusable for heavy rail traffic but still standing. The southern bridge had collapsed, twisted steel jutting from the water like the ribs of some great beast. Mission accomplished. Tactical success. 1 aircraft lost, 2 men dead, but the objective achieved. The mathematics of war, clean and simple and terrible. Rudel formed up with the survivors, 7 Stukas now, down from 9, and turned east, back toward Prussia, back toward safety and debriefing and the knowledge that tomorrow they would do this all over again. His hands were shaking on the stick, adrenaline finally catching up with reality. Below, Poland burned. Columns of smoke rose from a dozen locations, markers of where the new war had struck. Behind them, somewhere in the river mud, Steen's Stuka rested in its final position, already becoming part of history, already being forgotten by everyone except those who knew him. The flight back took 40 minutes. No one spoke on the radio. What was there to say? The morning sun climbed higher, indifferent to what had happened below it, and the Stukas droned homeward, their pilots sealed in cocoons of leather and plexiglass and private horror. When Rudel finally saw the German airfield ahead, he felt something break inside his chest. Not relief exactly, but something close to it, the kind of gratitude that comes from surviving when you shouldn't have. September 23, 1939. 22 days into the invasion of Poland. 22 days that felt like 22 years. Rudel Staffel had flown 68 combat missions, 68 dives into smoke and fire and screaming metal death. They'd lost 4 more aircraft since that first day at the Vistula. 8 more names added to the list that grew longer with each sunrise. The mess hall was quieter now, the jokes less frequent, the laughter forced when it came at all. Everyone was waiting. Waiting for their number to come up, for the flak burst with their name on it, for the moment when luck finally ran out, because luck always ran out eventually. That was the mathematics of war. Fly enough missions and probability caught up with you, dragged you down, turned you into smoke and memory. The target today was a Polish strongpoint near Modlin, north of Warsaw. A complex of bunkers and artillery positions that had been hammering the Wehrmacht's 3rd Panzer Division for 3 days straight. The ground forces needed air support. Needed it desperately. The mission briefing had been grim. Heavy fortifications, concentrated anti-aircraft batteries, defenders who knew the war was lost but fought anyway with the fury of men who had nothing left to lose. And the weather was shit. Low clouds at 3,000 feet, visibility maybe 2 miles on a good moment, rain coming in sheets that drummed against the briefing room windows like judgmental fingers. Abort conditions, someone muttered. They flew anyway. Because soldiers needed them. Because orders were orders. Because once you started down this path, there was no turning back. 12 Stukas took off into the gray morning, formation loose and ragged because the weather made tight flying suicidal. Rudel fought his aircraft through turbulence that made the Stuka buck and yaw like a wild horse. Rain hammered the canopy, reducing visibility to almost nothing. He flew on instruments, trusting the altimeter, the compass, his own trained instincts about where the ground was and how close he was getting to it. Beside him, visible only as a vague shadow in the murk, another Stuka struggled through the same hell. Behind him, Gatorman was silent, probably praying, probably wishing he'd volunteered for anything else. Infantry, artillery, even the goddamn Kriegsmarine would be better than this. At least on the ground or at sea, you could see what was trying to kill you. 5 minutes to target, Siegel's voice crackled through the static, barely audible over the storm. Rudel descended through the cloud layer, entering a gray void where up and down lost all meaning. For 30 seconds he flew blind, instruments only, trusting numbers and needles and the training that said this altitude plus this heading equals survival. The Stuka shuddered and groaned. Rain found every gap in the canopy, cold water running down his neck, soaking his collar. His hands were cramped on the stick, knuckles white, and he realized he'd been gripping too hard for too long. He forced himself to relax slightly, to breathe, to remember that panic killed faster than flak. Then he broke through the clouds at 3,800 feet and flew directly into hell. The Polish gunners had been waiting, listening for the scream of the Stukas, ready. The sky simply exploded. Black bursts filled the air like a malevolent garden, dozens of them, hundreds, a solid wall of shrapnel and explosive that turned the space between earth and cloud into a killing zone. Rudel saw it all in a fraction of a second. The flak bursts, the target below, bunkers and trenches and artillery positions dug into muddy hillsides, and the certain knowledge that flying through this was suicide. But there was no choice. The panzers needed them. The war needed them. History, indifferent and hungry, needed them. He rolled into the dive. 70 degrees. The dive brakes screamed. The world became vertical. And the first shell hit his left wing. The explosion tore a hole in the aileron the size of a dinner plate. Metal peeled back like flesh. The Stuka yawed hard left, trying to spin, trying to kill him. Rudel fought the stick with both hands, compensating, forcing the wounded aircraft to obey, but it was like wrestling an alligator. Nothing about the controls felt right anymore. "We're hit!" Gatorman shouted, and Rudel wanted to scream back that yes, obviously they were fucking hit, but there was no air for talking, no time for anything except the dive and the target and the desperate hope that they'd survive the next 10 seconds. 6,000 feet. 5,000. The flak followed him down, tracking him, hunters who'd found their prey and weren't letting go. A burst so close he could smell the cordite. Another that rattled the fuselage like a kick to the ribs. 4,500 feet. The engine cowling took a hit. The Jumo 211 coughed, sputtered, lost power. For one heart-stopping moment, the propeller windmilled uselessly, and Rudel stared at certain death. Then the engine caught again, black smoke pouring from the cowling, the sound wrong, damaged, dying but not dead yet. Below, the bunkers filled his bomb sight. He could see Polish soldiers at their guns, could see the muzzle flashes as they fired up at him, could see the desperation in their movements because they knew what was coming. 4,000 feet. Almost there. His thumb found the bomb release. Just a few more seconds. Just a little closer. And then the world ended. A 40mm shell exploded directly beneath the cockpit. The blast was beyond sound, beyond sensation. It was a physical force that lifted Rudel in his harness and slammed him back down. Shrapnel tore through the thin belly of the Stuka like a chainsaw through cardboard. Metal fragments filled the cockpit, spinning, lethal. Rudel felt a sharp, burning line of fire across his left thigh and looked down to see blood, his blood, soaking through his flight suit. The instrument panel shattered. Glass and metal and sparks and everything that told him altitude and speed and angle simply ceased to exist. The stick went loose in his hands, hydraulic fluid spraying from severed lines, coating the inside of the canopy in slick amber liquid. Behind him, Gatorman screamed, a sound so raw and primal it barely seemed human. They were dead. This was it. This was the mission they wouldn't return from. Rudel's name would join the list in the mess hall, and some young pilot would take his bunk, and the war would continue without him as if he'd never existed. 3,000 feet and falling. Too fast. The Stuka was in an uncontrolled dive now, the damaged wing making it spin slowly, sickeningly, the ground rotating in the broken windscreen like the view from inside a tumbling coffin. But some part of Rudel's brain, the part that had trained for this moment through endless repetition, the part that refused to quit even when quitting was the rational choice, stayed functional. His thumb, moving on pure instinct, found the bomb release and pressed. All 4 SC-50 bombs dropped free. The Stuka lurched upward slightly, 1,100 pounds lighter, and that tiny change was just enough. Rudel's right hand found the manual trim wheel. No hydraulics. No instruments. Just feel. Just the knowledge of how the Stuka should respond versus how it was responding, and the microscopic adjustments needed to bridge that gap. He cranked the wheel, muscles screaming. The nose was still pointing down at 70 degrees. The altimeter, or where the altimeter had been before it exploded, read 2,000 feet in his memory. Maybe less now. Maybe much less. He pulled back on the stick with every ounce of strength he had. The Stuka resisted. The dive was too steep, the damage too severe, the laws of physics too unforgiving. His right arm felt like it was being torn from the socket. The wound in his leg poured blood. Behind him, Gatorman had gone silent, unconscious or dead, and Rudel couldn't spare the attention to find out which. 1,500 feet. He could see individual Polish soldiers now, see them diving into trenches, see the expressions on their faces. The Stuka began to respond. Slowly. 1 degree. 2. The horizon appeared through the shattered windscreen, tilted at an insane angle but there, visible, real. 1,000 feet. The G-forces crushed him into his seat. His vision grayed. Blood vessels burst in his eyes. 5 degrees. 10. The nose coming up, the dive transitioning into something that might, possibly, if God or luck or physics smiled on him, become level flight. 500 feet. The altimeter in his mind screamed warnings. Too low. Too fast. Pull up, pull up, pull up. The Stuka leveled off at 300 feet, so low that Rudel could see the mud on the soldiers' boots, could see their mouths open in shouts, could see the fear and relief and confusion in their eyes as he roared overhead, trailing smoke and hydraulic fluid and blood and the promise of death that hadn't quite kept its appointment. Behind him, His 4 bombs detonated almost simultaneously. 4 thunderclaps that shook the air, 4 pillars of smoke and debris that rose into the rainy sky. He didn't see what they hit. Didn't care. He was alive. Impossibly, inexplicably, against all odds and logic, he was still breathing. But he was flying a corpse of an aircraft over enemy territory with a leg that might be bleeding out and a gunner who might be dead and absolutely no fucking idea how he was going to survive the next 5 minutes. The engine was dying. Rudel could hear it in the rough cough of the cylinders, feel it in the vibration coming through the stick, see it in the black smoke pouring from the cowling in a stream that marked his path across the sky like an arrow pointing to his grave. Every few seconds, the Jumo would miss a beat and the Stuka would drop 50 feet before catching again. He was losing altitude steadily, inexorably, and there was nothing he could do about it. Below, the landscape scrolled past. Polish farmland, muddy fields, scattered forests, all of it enemy territory where a downed German pilot could expect a bullet or worse. His left leg had gone from burning pain to a sick, cold numbness that terrified him more than the pain had. He couldn't look down at it, didn't dare take his eyes off what remained of his instruments and the landscape ahead, but he could feel the blood soaking through his flight suit, pooling in his boot, dripping onto the rudder pedals. Behind him, Gatorman stirred. A groan, weak but human, the most beautiful sound Rudel had ever heard. "I'm hit," the gunner managed, voice thick with pain. "Back, my back." But he was alive. They were both alive. For now. Rudel tried to respond, tried to say something reassuring or commanding or even just acknowledging, but his throat was too dry, his tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth. He managed a nod that Gatorman couldn't see, then focused on the only thing that mattered, finding somewhere, anywhere, to put this dying aircraft down before it fell out of the sky and killed them both. The rain had lightened to a drizzle, visibility improving to maybe 3 miles. Ahead, through the smoke and the cracked windscreen, he could see the front lines, or where he thought the front lines were. A region of churned earth and smoke where German and Polish forces were locked in combat. If he could just make it there. Just a few more miles. Just a few more minutes. The engine quit completely at 800 feet. One moment it was running rough, coughing and sputtering but still providing some thrust. The next, silence. The propeller windmilled uselessly in the slipstream, and the Stuka transformed from a powered aircraft into a glider. A very bad glider with a hole in one wing and no hydraulics and a pilot who was bleeding out. Rudel had maybe 2 minutes of glide time before he hit the ground. He scanned desperately for anything that looked like friendly territory. There, German tanks, Panzer IIIs with their distinctive silhouettes, advancing across a field. And beyond them, a recently harvested wheat field, relatively flat, relatively clear. It would have to do. The landing gear wouldn't extend, hydraulics shot to hell. He'd have to belly land. At least the ground was soft from the rain. Maybe that would help. Maybe it would just mean he'd dig his own grave on impact. Rudel lined up on the field, managing the glide slope by feel and instinct because every instrument that could have helped was now just wreckage scattered across the cockpit floor. The ground rushed up. He could see rocks, furrows, all the tiny obstacles that could flip the Stuka and kill them both. 200 feet. 100. He pulled back slightly, trying to bleed off speed, trying to grease the landing, trying to do the impossible with an impossible aircraft. 50 feet. The earth filled his vision. Gatorman was praying behind him, words in German and Latin tumbling together in a desperate litany. 20 feet. Rudel braced himself, hands locked on the stick, teeth clenched, and then they hit. The impact drove every bit of air from his lungs. The Stuka's belly struck the muddy earth and the world became a chaos of noise and violence. Metal shrieked. The airframe shuddered and bucked. Mud sprayed up over the windscreen, blinding him. The left wing, already damaged, caught on something, a furrow, a rock, physics itself, and the Stuka began to spin. Rudel's head snapped forward, his forehead smashing into the gun sight. Stars exploded across his vision. The spin continued, seemed to go on forever, the centrifugal force trying to tear him from his harness. Something else broke with a sound like a gunshot. The tail, maybe. Or another part of the wing. Or his own bones. Then, finally, impossibly, stillness. Silence. Except for the rain pattering on metal, and his own ragged breathing, and Gatorman's whimpering from the rear cockpit. Rudol's hands were still locked on the stick. He had to consciously force his fingers to uncurl, and even then they cramped painfully. Blood dripped from his forehead where he'd hit the sight, a gash that would need stitches. His left leg was a symphony of agony now that the adrenaline was fading. He looked down and saw the shrapnel wound, a ragged tear in his thigh, blood soaking everything. But the femoral artery was intact. He'd be dead already if it wasn't. Lucky. That word again. He tried to stand, to get out of the cockpit, but his leg gave out immediately and he collapsed back into the seat. Voices. German voices. Soldiers running toward the wreck. Survivors. We've got survivors here. Strong hands grabbed Rudel, lifted him bodily from the cockpit. He caught a glimpse of his Stuka as they carried him away. Broken, smoking, one wing crumpled, the fuselage torn open like a gutted fish. It would never fly again. But it had brought him home. Through flak and fire and damage that should have killed him 10 times over, it had brought him home. They laid him on the muddy ground. A medic appeared, cutting away his flight suit, probing the wound in his leg. Rudel turned his head and saw them lifting Gatorman out, conscious, moving, alive. The gunner's back was shredded with shrapnel, his flight suit dark with blood, but he was alive. "You crazy son of a bitch," Gatorman said, and laughed, and then passed out. The medic working on Rudel didn't have anesthesia. Just alcohol to clean the wound and forceps to dig out the shrapnel. "This is going to hurt," the medic said, unnecessarily. It did. Rudel bit down on a leather strap and stared at the gray sky while the medic worked, each probe of the metal sending lightning through his nervous system. He found 3 pieces of shrapnel, dropped them into a tin cup where they clinked like spare change. "You'll walk," the medic said. "Might limp. Give it 2 months. 2 months. The war would be over in 2 months, everyone said. Poland was finished. They'd all be home by Christmas, heroes, survivors, men who'd seen war and lived to tell about it. They loaded Rudel into an ambulance, really just a truck with a canvas cover and some blankets. Gatorman was already there, unconscious but stable. The truck bounced over rough roads, each jolt sending fresh waves of pain through Rudel's leg. But he was alive. They were both alive. Against all odds, against all logic, against the mathematics of war that said every mission was a roll of the dice, and eventually the dice came up snake eyes. They drove past burning Polish villages, past columns of refugees fleeing west, past a burned-out Polish tank with 3 bodies beside it. The war continued. It would continue tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that. But for Rudel, for now, it was over. The field hospital occupied a requisitioned schoolhouse 10 miles behind the lines. Children's drawings still decorated the walls, crayon sketches of houses and trees and families holding hands. Someone had tried to take them down, given up halfway through. Now they watched over rows of wounded men with the blank, innocent eyes that only children's art can manage. Rudel lay on a cot and stared at a drawing of a rainbow while nurses changed his bandages and doctors discussed his case in voices that pretended he couldn't hear. The wound would heal. The leg would work. He'd fly again. They were very sure of that last part, as if flying again was obviously what he'd want, obviously the goal, obviously the point. 3 days later, Rudel stood, with a cane, with considerable pain, with a limp he'd carry for the rest of his life, outside the schoolhouse and watched Stukas returning from missions. Fewer than had left. Always fewer. Hauptmann Siegel found him there, smoking a cigarette despite the fact that Rudel didn't smoke, had never smoked, but had bummed one off a soldier because it gave his hands something to do besides shake. They stood together in silence, watching the sky, watching the war continue without them. "You're grounded," Siegel said finally. "Medical. 2 weeks minimum." Rudel nodded. Felt relief and shame in equal measure. Relief that he wouldn't have to climb into that cockpit tomorrow, shame that he felt relieved. "Steen's parents wrote to me," Siegel continued. "Asked how he died. I told them it was quick. Instant. That he didn't suffer." Rudel took a drag on the cigarette, coughed. "Was it true?" Siegel looked at him for a long moment. "Does it matter?" No. It didn't. Truth was the first casualty of war, followed closely by everything else that made life worth living. They stood in silence again. Finally, Siegel spoke. "You know what the worst part is? We won. Your bombs destroyed 2 artillery positions. The panzers broke through 6 hours later. Mission successful." He lit his own cigarette. "But Steen's still dead. And tomorrow there'll be another target. Another mission. Another aircraft that doesn't come back. And we'll win again. Until we don't." Poland surrendered on October 6, 1939. 35 days. The Luftwaffe declared victory, talked about the triumph of Blitzkrieg, awarded medals and promotions and congratulations. Rudel received the Iron Cross Second Class in a muddy field while rain dripped from his cap. No ceremony. Just a brief presentation, a handshake, back to work. He didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man who'd survived when others hadn't, and he wasn't sure if that was skill or luck or some combination of both that he'd never understand. His leg healed slowly, imperfectly. By November he was flying again, training missions over Germany, teaching new pilots who looked impossibly young how to dive, how to aim, how to pull out before the ground killed them. Sometimes at night he woke up screaming, the sound of the Jericho trumpets echoing in his skull, Gatorman's screams mixing with his own, the smell of blood and smoke and fear filling his nostrils until he couldn't breathe. On a cold December morning, Rudel went home on leave. His mother hugged him for a long time, crying into his shoulder, and he let her because what else could he do? His father, a Lutheran pastor, gripped his shoulder and said simply, "I prayed for you every day." That night, Rudel stood in his childhood bedroom looking at model airplanes he'd built as a boy, simple things made of balsa wood and glue and dreams. He'd wanted to fly since he was 5 years old, wanted to touch the clouds, to be free, to escape gravity and earth and all the heavy things that kept people bound to the ground. He'd gotten his wish. He'd flown. He'd dived into hell and climbed out alive. But freedom, he understood now, was more complicated than altitude. And some things you couldn't escape, no matter how high you flew. He would fly 2,530 more combat missions before the war ended. Would become the most decorated German serviceman of World War II. Would destroy 519 tanks, sink a battleship, become a legend. But on that December night in 1939, he was just a 23-year-old who had seen men die, who carried shrapnel scars and nightmares, who had looked death in the face and been spared for reasons he couldn't understand and didn't deserve. He lay in his childhood bed and listened to wind outside the window. Somewhere beyond that window, winter was settling over Europe. And beyond winter, spring would come. And with spring, new wars, new battles, new targets. The Stuka would dive again. Would scream again. Would kill again. And Rudel would be in the cockpit. Not because he was a hero. Not because he wanted to. But because once you've dived into hell, once you've survived the unsurvivable, you're changed in ways that make the normal world impossible. The scream of the Jericho trumpets would echo in his dreams for the rest of his life, sometimes sounding like triumph, more often like grief, always like the mechanical shriek of a world tearing itself apart. Outside, snow began to fall on Germany, clean and white and pure, covering everything, hiding all the scars and blood and broken things beneath a blanket of forgetfulness. But memory doesn't work that way. Memory is shrapnel that never comes out, lodged too deep for any surgeon's forceps. Memory is a dive that never ends, even after you've landed, even after the war is over, even after everyone else has moved on. Hans Ulrich Rudel closed his eyes and tried to sleep. The sky would still be there in the morning. It always was. Waiting. Patient. Hungry for the next dive, the next mission, the next man who thought he could fly into hell and come out unchanged. He knew better now. Hell doesn't let you go that easily. You carry it with you, in your leg, in your dreams, in the tremor in your hands when you hear an aircraft engine or see a bridge or smell cordite on the wind. You carry it forever. That's the price of survival. That's what it means to dive into hell and fly out alive.